But it is good to be here again today as we enjoy this second Sunday of Advent in anticipation of the incarnation of Christ. And we are going to continue our examination of the book of Joshua this morning. Moving our way now into the 20th and 21st chapters of this book, chapters 20 and 21. And this is the last two chapters of the second section of this book. First section of the book, you remember, was the coming of the people of Israel across the Jordan into the land, taking possession of it by virtue of crossing over, and then the various conquests that the people of Israel needed to do in order to take possession of it, the conquests at Jericho and Ai and so many other cities, and then remember the southern conquests into the Negev and the northern conquests into the rest of Canaan, a period that lasted somewhere around 5 to 7 years of time, depending on how we understand Caleb's age in all of that. But nonetheless, that first phase being the initial coming of the Israelites into the promised land. But then the book turns to the discussion, the description of the allotment of the land now that the people have crossed into that land. And you remember that process was completed or started in 15 to 19. We'll see the end of it here this week. First, Judah, given the largest territory to the south, Joseph's sons in central Canaan, and then last week we looked at the 7 remaining tribes fitting into the remaining land, particularly to the north in Canaan. So all of the land of Canaan now being allocated to the various tribes. And a good reminder at this point is that the tribes to the east of the Jordan, of course, had been allotted their land long before the Israelites even crossed the Jordan. Moses had established that long before. These chapters then, 20 and 21, conclude this section by recounting the allocation of cities to the Levites throughout the land. These two chapters will deal with cities that are allotted to the Levites throughout the totality of the land. And there's going to be 2 parts to our examination of this. The first part is in chapter 20, the refuge cities under Levite control, and then the second chapter, the shared cities throughout the entirety of the land, including the Transjordan, which are all allocated to the Levites. All right, so 2 parts this morning. We'll start in chapter 20 with the cities of refuge allocated to the Levites. Now, to understand all of what's going on in chapters 20 and 21, we need to be reminded that the allocation of space for the Levites is described in Numbers 35 and repeated in Deuteronomy 19. Now, we'll go to Numbers 35 in a second, but let me just remind you of something here. The Levites are not allocated boundaried land in Israel. Unlike the other tribes, they are not going to get a space that's marked out by a set of boundaries that they can occupy. Rather, the tribe of Levi is going to be scattered throughout the entirety of Israel. Now, at first glance, we might assume that that's a curse rather than a blessing. Okay? Why don't we get land? That was a question, by the way, that they did raise at one point. But it's not a curse, it's a blessing. It's a blessing by God for this tribe. This tribe is going to be the priestly caste, the priestly helpers. And their inheritance then, God specifically says, is the privilege of serving Him amongst the people. Their inheritance isn't going to be a chunk of land. Their inheritance is going to be the opportunity for them to serve the Lord at the tabernacle and lead the people in worship. The Aaronic priesthood, the priesthood of the line of Aaron, is from within the Levitical line. Obviously, Aaron and Moses were Levites. So it's from the line of Aaron that the specific priestly caste would come. But the line of the entire family of Levi would serve as the helpers to the priests at the tabernacle. So the Levitical line is twofold. There's the Aaronic priesthood, the specific family through which the priest would come, and then the rest of the tribe which would serve as the helpers to those priests. Now, I mentioned this briefly last week when we were talking about Simeon. This blessing of Levi is actually a part of the blessing of Jacob that's outlined in Genesis 49. When Jacob, at the end of his life, brings his sons to him and blesses them, he lumps Levi and Simeon together and puts a blessing over them. And it really doesn't look like a blessing. It looks more like a curse. You remember, it's these two brothers, Levi and Simeon, who chose to avenge Dinah's assault earlier by killing those who had assaulted her. That's found in Genesis 34. And so Jacob, when putting his hands upon these two sons, designated them to be scattered in Israel. He specifically says that in 49:7. Jacob designated them to be relegated, if you will, to a lesser position within Israel than their brothers. When he put that blessing upon them, he actually put this blessing of a scattering. Now, in his case, it would have really been a curse more than a blessing, but there's a strange twist to this. Their taking of life rendered them cursed because, as Jacob saw it, life is sacred to God. Their violence had spoken against them then in receiving these blessings. But here's the strange twist. This blessing given by Jacob over the Levites is redeemed at the golden calf incident. If you remember the story, when the Israelites are at the foot of the mountain and Moses up on the mountain, they make a calf and they worship it. Well, Moses comes back down and he calls the people to himself that wish to remain faithful to him and faithful to the law that he's come with. And it's the Levites that rally to his side. It's the Levites, his own tribe, but nonetheless, it is the Levites that come. And it's because of this that God blesses them. In fact, Moses says that because they have come to him and are willing to actually kill their unfaithful brothers in the other tribes, and even in their own tribe, who had worshipped this calf, that God had ordained them for the service of the Lord. So you put together the blessing of Jacob on the one side, or the curse of Jacob, I guess we'd call it, and the redemption of the Levites at the golden calf incident, and that's how you get to this place where the Levites become this unique tribe. Yahweh combined the blessing of Jacob and Moses over the Levites in scattering them. Jacob said, "You're going to be scattered." That was kept. And Moses said, "You're going to be the servants of the Lord." And that was kept. And Yahweh took that scattering and used it as a means by which he would scatter the Levites and then make them useful throughout all of Israel to be the priestly caste. That sets the basis for what we're looking at in these two chapters. You really have to know that. You have to think about that in order to understand what's going on here. The allocation of these cities in chapters 20 and 21 is based entirely on all of that. The blessing by Jacob, the blessing by Moses. Now, the allocations of the cities of refuge that are mentioned in chapter 20 is first mentioned in Numbers 35. All right, so if you have your Bible, turn it back to Numbers chapter 35. We haven't quite gotten there in our reading through the book of Numbers yet, but we're getting close. We're up to 30 this morning. So in a few weeks when we get to 35, remember this as we read it. Here's what Numbers 35 says. I'm going to read the first 8 verses to you this morning. The Lord spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho. Where are they? They're in the Transjordan. They're across the Jordan in anticipation of coming into the promised land. Command the people of Israel to give to the Levites some of the inheritance of their possession as cities for them to dwell in. And you shall give to the Levites pasture lands around the cities. The cities shall be theirs to dwell in, and their pasture lands shall be for their cattle and for their livestock and for all their beasts. The pasture land of the cities, which you shall give to the Levites, shall reach from the wall of the city outward 1,000 cubits all around. And you shall measure outside of the city On the east side, 2,000 cubits, and on the south side, 2,000 cubits, and on the west side, 2,000 cubits, and on the north side, 2,000 cubits, the city being in the middle. This shall belong to them as pasture land for their cities. The cities that you give to the Levites shall be the 6 cities of refuge, there's the reference, where you shall permit the manslayer to flee, and in addition to them you shall give 42 cities. All the cities that you give to the Levites shall be 48 with their pasture lands. And as for the cities that you shall give from the possession of the people of Israel, from the larger tribes you shall take many, and from the smaller tribes you shall take few, each in proportion to the inheritance that it inherits, shall give of its cities to the Levites. All right, so this is the first mention of this issue of the cities of refuge. The cities of refuge are a part of the allotment to the Levites. This is why Joshua 20 and 21 are included together in this sermon this morning. The Levites are not mentioned in chapter 20, but it's their cities. It's the cities of refuge that belong to them. So this entire 2 chapters has to do with the allocation to the Levites. 6 of the 48 total cities given to the Levites would be cities of refuge. Now, Numbers 35:9 to 34 goes on to describe in detail the nature of these cities of refuge that are mentioned in verse 6. I'm not going to read it all, but let me summarize what it is that's being said. The law of God specifically prescribed capital punishment for murder. The law of God specifically prescribes capital punishment for murder. That's mentioned in a number of places, but it's specifically mentioned in Numbers 35, verse 30 and following. If anyone kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death on the evidence of witnesses, but no person shall be put to death on the testimony of one witness. Anyone kills a person, they shall be put to death. That's fundamental to the law of God. It's prescribed that way. And the law of God had prescribed that the person known as the avenger, or the avenger of blood is another way to say it, it has the responsibility in the family to carry out this punishment for his family. Someone in the family, sometimes referred to as the kinsman redeemer, Numbers 35:21, has the responsibility to carry out this act. It reads like this in Numbers 35:21. The one who strikes down another is a murderer. The avenger of blood shall put the murderer to death when he meets him. So see, the way that the law worked is that God would prescribe that murder was a capital offense, and someone in the family, defending the family, shall put this person to death. It becomes their responsibility to chase him down and to kill him. The reason for this law is outlined specifically at the end of chapter 35, starting in verse 33. Murder was designed, the punishment for murder is a better way to put that. The punishment for murder was designed to keep the land of Israel holy. The sanctity of life at the center of God's formation of his image bearers stands at the center of his law. Because he is the one who created life, he is the one who breathed life. That life comes from him. Doesn't come from outside of him. It comes directly from him into the image bearer. And so it becomes central to the very essence of what it means to be human, and more specifically, the land of Israel staying holy. Here's what God says. You shall not pollute the land in which you live. You shall not murder in this land, is what that means. For blood pollutes the land. And no atonement can be made for the land for the blood that is shed in it, that is blood by murder, except by the blood of the one who shed it. In other words, the atonement mechanism in the law that God sees is life for life. You take life, human life, purposely, conscientiously, then your life is to be substituted as an atonement. Not your atonement, the atonement of the land. The atonement of the people. You understand that distinction. We, in our society, think of justice only as a personal matter. But that's not how ancient Israel saw it. Ancient Israel saw atonement as a national issue as much as an individual issue. The land becomes polluted by a murderer. The land needs to be atoned for, and the only way that can be done is by the blood of the one who committed the act. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in the midst of which I dwell, for I, the Lord, dwell in the midst of the people of Israel. God had made it very clear that human life was sacred in his sight because it came from him. Murder, then, the intentional taking of human life, taking the life of image bearers that he himself had formed and breathed into, was an offense which defiled the very land upon which the people stood, the very land he himself dwelt in. It must be addressed seriously because it is a serious crime. Which leads, of course, to this side truth: the judgment of God upon America is in no little measure because of its quickness to shed the blood of his image bearer. We want to know why our nation is under judgment? It's because we are quick to shed blood. However, even in spite of this reality, God, in his mercy, had provided for the manslayer. Chapter 35, verse 11. A manslayer is a person who accidentally kills another person. This is not an act of murder. This is an act of accidental homicide. Any Israelite, meaning any natural resident, any sojourner, meaning any permanent resident, not an Israelite, but a permanent resident of the land, or even any sojourner, meaning, or stranger, someone coming into the land and simply passing through, who unintentionally kills another human being, is considered a manslayer. So it doesn't just apply to a native-born Israelite. It applies to anyone coming into the land. Now, the law of murder would also apply to anyone coming into the land, but in this particular case, the law is clear that a manslayer, someone who accidentally kills another, unintentionally takes another human life, falls into this exception. And the exception is that there are places where such a person can flee for protection from the consequences in the law of murder. Again, who's going to carry out that sentence? Answer: someone from within the family who has taken the responsibility as the kinsman redeemer, as the avenger of blood, to chase down and kill the one who has killed another. But if you are in that situation where you've accidentally killed someone, you can flee to a city of refuge and be protected against the avenger of blood who would be chasing you down. Since the manslayer believes that his killing of another was unintentional, he can flee to a city of refuge so that the prescribed punishment for murder is not immediately applied. Now, I use the word immediately because you don't just get to flee to a city of refuge and hide there and think you're safe. That's not how it works. There's some things that need to be done here. The law prescribes in Numbers 35 that your case, once you get there, needs to be heard by the judges of the city and the congregation of the city itself, and potentially the punishment lifted. Here's how it reads in Numbers 35. The city shall be for you a refuge from the avenger, that the manslayer may not die until he stands before the congregation for judgment. The congregation shall judge between the manslayer and the avenger of blood in accordance with these rules. And the congregation shall rescue the manslayer from the hand of the avenger of blood, and the congregation shall restore him to his city of refuge, to which he had fled, and he shall live in it until the death of the high priest who was anointed with oil. All right, now what is all that saying? Well, here's what it's saying. In the city of refuge, when the manslayer arrives in the city, the people will hear his case and decide his claim. He will come there and he will make his case. So he comes and stands trial. In this case, standing trial for homicide. And it is up to the city, it is up to the judges of the city and the congregation to decide whether he is telling the truth or not in regards to his intentions in the death of the one that he has killed. Now, if he's found guilty, meaning that he has lied, he has therefore been found guilty of murder, and he is cast out of the city. Which means, of course, that the avenger of blood then can kill him. However, if he is found not guilty, notice I didn't say innocent, I said not guilty. He's found not guilty, he remains in the city under its protection until the current high priest dies. Now, the question is why? The high priest could be around for a while. I mean, if the high priest at this point was a very young man and lived to be an old man, you might be stuck in that city for a very long time. It's the punishment for manslaughter. In other words, you're not getting away with this death without any sort of punishment at all. You are, in fact, being forced to live in this city for the rest of the life of that high priest. And that's your punishment for the crime of manslaughter in this case. Not homicide, murder, but manslaughter, intentional homicide. After the high priest died, then, you are free to return home. And the assumption is there would be no remaining penalty. The avenger of death then is supposed to put that aside because the high priest has died. The death of the high priest then absolves the manslayers from the cities of their offense, and they're allowed to return home. So in other words, the cities of refuge serve as a means of justice in the land. They're not just places where people who commit murder can run and hide and be protected. No, they serve a specific purpose of bringing the justice of God against homicide, but they're making the clear distinction between those who kill intentionally and those who do so accidentally. It's still placing a high value on human life, that's the justice side of this equation, such that a man who kills another man, even doing so accidentally, now will have to suffer the consequences of that. He's going to have to go live in one of the 6 refuge cities for the rest of the high priest's life, which could be a while. But nonetheless, it doesn't allow for the injustice of innocent men, people killing accidentally, to be executed. So there's provision provided in this. Now, most of what I've just said about the cities of refuge is repeated in Joshua 20, verses 1 to 6 and verse 9. Joshua simply repeats all of these conditions in this text because he's reminding his audience, you remember, the people he's writing to, he's reminding them of what these cities of refuge are about, what they're supposed to be about. I think he's more specifically reminding the Israelites, the Levites I should say, about what this is all about. So that as these cities of refuge are established, they will know what to do there. Okay, so back to Joshua chapter 20. Now we see in verses 7 and 8 the specific refuge cities that are established. And there are 6 of them, as I said. The first is the city of Kadesh, verse 7, part A. Kadesh will be in the hill country of the tribe of Naphtali. This is in the northernmost section of Canaan proper, the west side of Canaan. The city is Shechem, verse 7, part B. This one will be in the central part of Canaan, in the hill country of Ephraim. There will be, by the way, a covenant renewal service being held here at Shechem at the end of Joshua's life in Joshua chapter 24. But this is a refuge city in the central section of Canaan. The third is Kiriath Arba. We've heard that name before. It's also known as the city of Hebron in verse 7c. It's in the hill country of Judah. This is the city that Caleb took from the Anakim as his inheritance. So it becomes a refuge city for the Levites. It's in the southern section of Canaan. So it's on the west side of the Jordan in the south part of Canaan. The fourth city, verse 8, part A, is Bezer. Bezer is in the tableland of Reuben. This would be in the southern section of the Transjordan. It would be on the other side of the river, the east side of the river, but in the south side of that section. These 3 cities, Bezer, the next 3 cities, are pre-allocated or were pre-allocated by Moses to these tribes in Deuteronomy 4:41. So when Moses, long before, had given this space on the eastern side of the river to the Israelites, he had already established these three cities. First of them is Bezer. The second is Ramoth in verse 8, part B. It's going to be in the plains of Gilead, in the tribe of Gad. That'll be in the central section of the Transjordan. And then the sixth city is Golan, which is in the area of Bashan. Again, that name should be familiar to you. Remember, Og of Bashan was one of the kings killed by the Israelites. In this area, this will be in the north section of the Transjordan. It will be in the territory of East Manasseh in the north. Now, if you're paying attention, you've noticed what I just did. 6 cities scattered throughout the entirety of the land in all 6 geographical areas of Canaan. 3 on the west, 3 on the east. 1 in the north, 1 in the central, 1 in the south. 1 in the north on the other side of the river, 1 in the center, 1 in the south. Notice how wise our God is. Because what he does is he puts a city close to wherever you're living. In other words, if you're living in Reuben and you accidentally kill a man, you don't have to run across the Jordan and run over to Shechem on the other side in order to find a place of refuge. There's one nearby. So no matter where you are geographically in either the western side or the eastern side, there's a city close by. You don't have to flee too far to get there. Now, that is the 6 cities of refuge established for the Levites of the 48 total given to them according to Numbers 35. So chapter 21 now moves into the allocation of the cities. Again, the allocation of the cities for the Levites is described in Numbers 35, repeated in Deuteronomy 19. 48 cities throughout Israel were to be set aside for the Levites. That includes the 6 cities we just mentioned. And you will find their names also mentioned again in chapter 21 as a part of the 48 being established. 48 total cities scattered throughout Israel. Now, it is probably more proper to say that these are villages rather than cities. When we think of cities, we have a tendency to think of large places with lots of people. It is more likely that God gave to the Levites small villages, 48 of them, around Israel, for them to be set aside to reside in and use their surrounding pasture lands. Now, I had read from Numbers 35 God's instruction about the pasture lands. Each little village was to have a diameter of 1,000 cubits out from its center around the city as its pasture lands. In other words, 2,000 cubits from this side to this side. That's the distinction in the passage. It's hard to, at first glance, it's hard to say, well, did he give them 1,000 or did he give them 2,000? No, he gave them 2,000 across by diameter, 1,000 by radius. You know what radius and diameter are, right? The difference between the two? He stopped listening half an hour ago. Radius from the center of the city to the edge, diameter from edge to edge, 2,000 cubits across. So a space around the outside of 2,000 cubits across, 1,000 cubits from the end. So about 1,500 feet from the center of the city out to the edge in every direction, or roughly a quarter of a mile out from the center of the city to the edge in every direction from the village was to be the grazing land of the Levites. Beyond 1,000 cubits, beyond the quarter mile, which isn't really that far, from the city's edge belonged to the tribe in which the village sat. So it belonged to the tribe. It went back to being tribal land. So in other words, God gave just a small little area around the outside of each of these little villages for them to raise their livestock. Now, 2 things you need to note here. Number 1, the Levites were not to plant crops. Not enough space, really, in this 1,000 cubits outside to grow enough crops to support your people. That's number 1. And number 2, they were not to own any herds of their own. So the question is, why give them grazing land if they're not supposed to own any herds? Answer, they would be given many animals as a part of the sacrificial system that would be given as various offerings unto the priests The priests then would use this land to keep those cattle alive until they were then used in the various sacrificial systems. In other words, God only needed to give them a small space around each village to graze these animals because there wouldn't be that many. The Levites are not in the business of being farmers and ranchers. They're not. They are to be priests and priestly helpers. But they're going to wind up having animals to deal with, and so God provisioned for them to be able to use this land for keeping the animals given to them by the other tribes as a part of their worship functions. Now let me just pause it and sort of comment here. I think it's possible that these villages were not exclusively the domain of the Levites. Okay, in other words, the Levites were allowed to live in these cities and to graze the area around the cities, but they were not the exclusive domain of the Levites themselves. And the reason I believe that is because you remember the city, one of the 6 cities that was given was also the city that Caleb had inherited. His family was living there. So I'm inclined to believe that the Levites were allowed to live in 38 specific villages throughout Israel, but they would be living in those villages alongside of other Israelites also living in those villages. That's how I'm inclined to read this. It's possible that God said those cities are specifically for the Levites and all others must move out, but it makes much more sense that this 1,000 cubit thing would be, okay, around this little village where you have both Levites and non-Levites living, the Levites are going to get the first ring of space right around the city, but all the rest of you that are living inside, you get to take all the land outside of that 1,000 cubits. Because who else would be grazing the land outside of a little village? Well, obviously the people living in the village. I mean, if you have another village that's a few miles away, they're probably not going to be coming all the way to this space. So it makes much more sense to me that these cities were actually occupied by both. It also makes sense to me that they would be so because, remember, the Levites were designed to be the yeast in the loaf. They were designed to be spread and scattered throughout the people, so they're living amongst the others. If you would cocoon them in little villages by themselves without any other Israelites there, they might have a tendency over time to become only concerned about themselves and not be concerned about the others, which was what their job was. So I'm inclined to think that they were living together. The second thing to keep in mind is that these allocation of cities for the Levites was to be prorated based upon the size of each tribe. I said in verse 6 of chapter 35, Numbers 35, more cities in the territory of the larger tribes, fewer cities in the smaller tribes. That makes sense, right? You have less people living in some area, you give them less villages because you would need less Levites living there to help that smaller group. Larger groups would mean more Levites. That makes sense. Okay. So in verses 4 to 42, we have the allocation of each of the individual cities. Again, I'm not going to go through this verse by verse and city by city and explain where they all are. If you want to do that, spend a week at it. But I want you to notice that the census given of the Levites is also included in Numbers chapter 26. You remember that there was a census of all the various tribes. We've looked at all of them so far, but now we have one more, and that's the census of the Levites in Numbers 26, 57 to 62. The Levite tribe measures 23,000. But it specifically points out in Numbers 26 that this census is not measuring males from 20 years old and up. It's measuring every male from 1 month old and up. About the age of the one that just walked out of here or was dragged out of here against his will. You will notice that the Lord did a census differently in Levi than he did amongst the rest of the peoples. And that's important to think about. Because they're numbered separately from the rest of the census, first of all, and a different census method is used. Why? Because the Levites are unique. Because the Levites are a unique tribe, and every single male in the Levite tribe is significant to the work of the tribe. Every single Levite was important. Every single male Levite was important to the work of that tribe. Whereas in the other tribes, the census is counting those who are 20 years old and up, meaning they are able to go to war. They can be soldiers. We talked about this very early in the book when the tribe of Reuben sent their men with the rest of the tribes across the Jordan, that the men who went across were the fighting men 20 years old and up, which means that the remaining people back in the Transjordan for those tribes would have been men younger than 20, men older than about 50, women, and children would have all been included and left behind. But in the case of the Levites here, God counts every single male, a month old and up. And I think a month old is simply because that child survived past childbirth to the place where he is now a fully functioning human being. Okay, we're talking about ancient times here, right? So God sees the Levites in that fashion. So the allocation of verses 4 to 42 is done by clan in order determined by lot. Done by clan of the Levites, done by order of lot. And the cities of refuge above are included in the allocation of the 48 cities below. There's only 3 clans in Levi. There's only 3 clans. You see it in Numbers 26. You see it also here. The first is the clan of Kohath, verses 4 through 5 and 9 to 20. In verses 4 and 5, we learn that there are 13 cities from the tribes of Judah, Simeon, and Benjamin for the descendants of Aaron, the priestly line, and then 10 cities from Ephraim, Dan, and West Manasseh. Okay, so the tribe of Aaron, or the line of Aaron, the family of Aaron, which is part of the clan of Kohath, is given 13 cities from Judah, Simeon, and Benjamin. I find that fascinating that God put the priestly line in the south. It's going to be the one that survives, by the way, when the exiles start to happen. Okay, so the priestly line is going to be the south. It's also going to be where the temple is going to be built eventually. But then, for the remaining clan of Kohath, 10 cities from Ephraim, Dan, and West Manasseh. The second clan is Gershon, verse 6. 13 cities from Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, and East Manasseh. Verses 27 to 33 then of the chapter describe the exact cities and where they are. And then finally, the clan of Merari, verse 7. 12 cities from Reuben, Gad, and Zebulun. 34 to 40 then of the chapter describes the cities specifically given to Merari. Now you will notice all 12 tribes, meaning the sons of Jacob and Joseph. Remember, Joseph has got 2 sons included in this list. All 12 tribes have Levites living amongst them. When you get to the end of this chapter, you discover that all 12 of the tribes are mentioned as having a city in them. The scattering of the Levites is now complete. As you go to verses 41 and 42, it says, the cities of the Levites in the midst of the possession of the people of Israel were in all 48 cities with their pasture lands. These cities each had its pasture lands around it, so it was with all these cities. The allocation of these cities is designed to spread the Israelites out throughout all the tribes of Israel so that every tribe has a Levitical presence. And the number of cities in each one is determined by the size of those particular tribes. Which leads us then to verses 43 to 45. As I said at the beginning, this is the end of the section involving the allocation of the land. First Judah, then the sons of Joseph, then the remaining tribes, now the Levites. So in verses 43 to 45, Joshua, I noticed last week I called him Joseph a couple times. Joshua, the writer of this book, pens these words to summarize the entirety of this allocation. Not just the Levites, but all of this second section of the book. Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give their fathers. And they took possession of it. And they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. The allocation of Canaan, both sides, has now been completed in accordance with God's promise to give this land to the descendants of Abraham. They took possession of it, which means they began to drive out the natives and live in the land. God gave them rest on every side. They conquered all the major cities in the territory. Not every city, but all the major cities. God gave over all their enemies. They have begun to overthrow all of the various people groups that are included in the land. And all the good promises of the Lord have come to pass. Yahweh had shown through them powerfully his intention to keep his promises to the patriarchs. Now, when you read that paragraph, your first inclination is to say, it didn't actually happen. Well, actually it did. Depends on how you read it. Yes, God had given them the land. Now they're in it, right? God had given them favor over their enemies. Yes, they had had victories over all the various enemies that they had encountered. True, the conquest is still going to take another 400 years to the days of David to be completed. But in a sense, Joshua is saying everything that we attempted to do in this time frame, God gave us the ability to do it. We walked into this land, we started occupying cities, we allocated its space, God kept all of his promises, here we are. So Joshua is really, in a sense, writing an epitaph to his own life. We were successful here. We didn't accomplish everything because it wasn't God's intention for Joshua to have dislodged and killed all of the natives of the land. That was not God's intention. We sort of read it that way. We assume that the conquest should have been completed under Joshua. But reading the text correctly implies to us that no, God intended for the conquest of Israel to continue all through the theocracy, even up to the days of the monarchy. And so Joshua can write this. He can say, yeah, we had success. It would be much like me saying, are you a believer? Well, yeah, I'm a believer. Are you fully sanctified before God? Well, no, not quite. So are you a believer or not? And the answer is, well, I'm both. Yes, I am a believer. I am fully justified in the sight of God, but I'm not fully yet sanctified in the sight of God. Remember that already and not yet sense that always exists in Scripture? Well, here it is again. There's an already sense. Yes, we have accomplished these things, but it's not completely fulfilled. So what do we do with these two chapters in the 21st century? Because of all the chapters of the allocation, this one, while at first glance might seem to be the hardest to apply to us, because Levites, do we see any Levites around? Yet at the same time, it is the easiest to apply to us. Because here's why. The Levites were a special provision by God amongst the Israelites. The Levites were a special provision given by God. The entire tribe, an entire tribe of Israel, was scattered throughout the land, dedicated to carrying out the will of God amongst the people, right? That's the whole point of the Levites. God set them aside. He said, yes, I know that your ancient ancestor committed murder himself. Isn't that ironic? But I have redeemed them because they stood at Moses' side and stood up for the law of God, the sacredness of life. They stood up for that. So I have blessed them and scattered them throughout Israel. I have made them a unique people. I have set them aside to myself. As the priestly caste, they would aid the people in their relationship to God. The Levites would be helpful to the people in that vertical relationship between God and man. They would be the ones who would serve at the tabernacle, the priests making the sacrifices, the Levites doing the other things of the tabernacle, all leading the people in a continuing relationship with a holy God. A vertical responsibility. But they would also be very much a part of God's special provision for the horizontal relationship of people one to another in the law. They would aid the people in the cities of refuge, for example, to uphold justice amongst the people, making the law of God significant in the minds and hearts of the people. The cities of refuge would be a constant reminder of the importance of life to God and how important it was that human beings not kill one another. So, the Levites then, in this capacity, have a special provision And this special provision of God over the Levites foreshadows the Messiah. It is a picture of the coming Christ. How, you might ask? And the answer is this. Here's the reality. Every single human being living on planet Earth since the beginning of time is guilty of a capital offense. Every single human being living on this planet is guilty of a capital offense. And every single human being is being chased by a divine avenger of blood. Now that statement will get me thrown out of most churches in America. Because that avenger is God himself. It's a very unpopular kind of thinking today, right? The modern idea, the modern theological perspective of God, the modern description of God given most frequently today is, well, God is love. His name is love. He loves us. No matter how we think of him, he loves us. This modern idea is that God is love, and this view of God as love contradicts this idea of a relationship of God to humanity. To talk about God as being an avenger of blood is foreign to the thinking of most Baptists even today. The idea that God is a God of wrath who is chasing the one who has committed a capital offense against him, that's very unpopular, but it's very biblical. Romans chapter 1 verse 18 says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and righteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. But we also learn from chapter 12 of that same book, beloved, never avenge yourself, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, quote, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Who's repaying? In 1 Thessalonians 4:6, Paul says, walk pleasing to God, that no one transgress and wrong his brother in this matter, that is in the matter of physical passion, because the Lord is an avenger in all these things. And even Jesus himself said, do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell, not just here. And who is that? Who's the only person who can kill the soul in hell? And that is God. No one else can do that. All of us as human beings are being chased by an unrelenting avenger of blood who has determined to kill those who have broken his law. Because any violation of the law of God is a capital offense. Any violation of the law of God. If at any moment during the course of the last week you fail to love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself, you have committed a capital offense. When Adam ate from a fruit, it was a capital offense. God said, you shall not eat from that tree. The day you do, you shall surely go to jail. No. He said, you shall surely die. Death was the punishment for eating from a tree, for Pete's sake. Every crime, every sin, I should say, to follow is a capital crime against a holy God, because his nature is such that he who gave you life from his nature, and his nature is holy, and any action against his holiness on your part, either by omission or commission, is a capital offense. And we are being chased by an unrelenting avenger of blood. It is God who is chasing humanity for its sin. Whole different perspective of God, isn't it, than what is so very common in the world today. This view of God that permeates Christianity today, which is the very same as a parent watching a 2-year-old steal a cookie from the cookie jar. Oh, isn't that cute? God never says that when he looks at me or you. He never says, oh, isn't that cute? No. No, our God sees sin in its proper way. A capital offense against his holiness, worthy of death. But, and you knew there had to be a but here, right? But God, in his mercy, has provided a refuge from his own wrath. God himself, the avenger of blood himself, has given to us a refuge from his own wrath. And that refuge is in Christ Jesus. Now we know firstly that Christ is our great high priest, right? He's greater than the Aaronic line contained in the Levites. The writer of the Hebrews is clear that this high priest that comes doesn't come from the line of Levi. He comes from the line of Melchizedek. He comes from a much greater priesthood because this Christ has mediated through his own blood a propitiation for the wrath of God. That this priest who we run to doesn't just satisfy God with some sort of sacrifice made from a bull. No, it is his own blood that he sheds on behalf of a people. He mediates a better covenant because he mediates through his own blood. He's a greater high priest. But he's also our city of refuge because he's greater than the Levitical cities of refuge because Jesus has become a permanent place of refuge for those who will run to him. Those who will run to Christ will find a refuge that isn't temporary. You don't need to run to Christ and then stand trial as to whether or not you're guilty. Because as soon as you come into the presence of Christ, Christ looks at you and goes, guilty. You've committed a capital offense. But because you've run to me, I'm not going to throw you out of the city. I'm going to keep you for myself. Because you have run to me, I'm going to hold you fast to myself. I am going to be a permanent refuge for you. You're never going to need to worry about the avenger of blood anymore. Because I am standing, mediating for you forever. 47 times in the Psalms, 47 times in the Psalms, it speaks of running to God himself for refuge. Good example is Psalm 2:12. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. Now, by the way, I could spend a half an hour on that verse as a sermon, maybe 50 minutes. Because there's an interesting paradox in the verse. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry with you. Blessed are all those who take refuge in him. In a strange and twisted way, the verse is saying, go and take refuge in the one chasing you down to kill you. And the way that's accomplished, of course, is by the Son coming to guarantee our refuge before the Father. Kiss the Son. But this idea of refuge not only is found 47 times in the Psalms, it's also very much in the New Testament. Here's what the writer of Hebrews says in chapter 6. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise, that's us, the unchangeable character of his purpose, He guaranteed it with an oath. So that by two unchangeable things, his nature and his oath, what he is and what he has said, those are the two things. The two things in which he has, two unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain. Who did that? Christ went into the inner place. He went into the very presence of the Father with his own blood behind the curtain and offered it to the Father so that we could be an anchor in him. Where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. A priesthood far greater than the Levitical priesthood. Do you understand what's being said here? We have all committed capital crime against God. We have all violated his law. We have all deserved to be killed. We all deserve to be destroyed. We have all committed murder against God himself. We have intentionally broken his law more times than you can count. And he is the avenger. But he sent his only begotten Son into the world to act as a refuge. You go to him, even though he's the one chasing you. You run to him. And when you run to him by faith, he becomes the perfect high priest that holds you now in a state where the avenger is no longer chasing you. And never, ever will. Because the Christ has come to the Father and said, this one is mine. You gave him to me. I died for him. And the Father relents from his wrath because the Son bore that wrath already for us. See, my friends, faith is not to run away from God, the avenger of blood, but to run towards him as the very refuge we need. We know inherently, all human beings know, that they are under the edict of death by God. They know that. Paul writes that at the end of Romans 1. We know that. All human beings know that. And it is our natural inclination as fallen human beings to run away. We're going to flee from the avenger. But what we're supposed to do in faith is to turn around and run towards him. Run to him. And throw ourselves into his mercy as the high priest that shields us from the wrath of God forever. You see, my friends, Advent is a season to remember that God sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sin, to bear the wrath, in anticipation of the day when we will live with him in the eternal city of refuge, where we will be in him and under him and protected by him from all wrath forever and forever. Being in Christ is the only place that we find refuge, and we find it by faith in him.